When it comes to breaking scoring barriers in golf, breaking 80 can be one of the most difficult things to do, and yet it's the goal of so many golfers out there. I want to share with you my thoughts on things that you can be doing to improve your chances of breaking 80 consistently. I think it's fair to recognize immediately that every golfer is slightly different and your strengths and weaknesses are going to be different from each other. But I'm going to share with you things that I think are key and consistent across the board in terms of golfers who break 80 consistently. The first thing you need to do is you need to track your performance. You need to use scoring apps that allow you to track each area of your game closely. If you don't measure something, you can't manage or improve it. You don't know if it's a strength or a weakness. One of the challenges in golf is that so many of the bad shots we hit are attached with too much emotion that we place more value, more weight on an area of our game that may not necessarily be the area that we need to be working on. Tracking your stats through a number of rounds is an extremely beneficial way for you to start to look at your game objectively and highlight the areas that you need to practice. If you were trying to lose weight, you'd track calories. If you're trying to improve your score, you should be tracking your performance across each area of your golf game. There's many different apps out there that can help you, but putting in that extra effort will really help. And obviously, as you're getting closer to shooting under 80, the margin of error reduces and the area for marginal gains reduces. You can't take a great big leap in an area of your game. You've already improved your golf to a decent level in most areas, as I would expect. So you've got to look for those areas where you can just make those small improvements, those incremental improvements that will take you from shooting in the 80s to shooting in the 70s. From an improved technique point of view, I think the most critical thing you can do is improve the quality and the consistency of your ball striking. And that applies to both irons and driver. We'll talk about driver shortly, but for the irons, consistent ball striking equals consistent distance. If I strike the ball out of the center of the club face more often, I'm going to get a much more predictable ball speed off the club face, which will produce a more predictable distance. Good golf and good golfers hit their clubs the distance that they expect to. They don't have a wild range of short and long when it comes to hitting any particular club. So quality and consistency of ball striking is key. Taking out some of the potential power or maximum speed that you might have in your stroke and sacrificing that for better quality and consistency of strike will improve your score. Golfers who shoot lower scores hit more greens, and when they miss greens, they're closer to the green. So that shows that they hit the center of the club face or closer to the center of the club face more often. Great exercise that you can do to help you work on that would be feeling like you keep your arms and your wrists much straighter into the through swing and into the follow through. I'd use Tommy Fleetwood as a nice example of someone who manages the radius of their swing in a very productive way. Many of you will look at some great players and watch their follow-throughs get longer and wrap around their head. Unfortunately for you, you're not capable of controlling the club moving at that speed, and instead, as it goes past you, you get a lot of wrist flexing, you get a lot of arm flexing. That messes up the radius, messes up the contact point on the club face. And once you start mishitting across the face, you're going to see a much wider spread in those distances that you hit these clubs. So my test and my recommendation to you would be to go to the range, take your club, and try to hit balls where your goal is to hit 10 shots and try to hit the ball within reason as close as possible to the same distance. Use the follow through where the arms stay straighter. It's almost like a punch swing. Full back swing, and then a punch follow through. In doing that, I'm going to get a more predictable strike, which is going to produce that consistent distance. And if I can have a consistent distance with my clubs, as I said already, I can hit the ball the distance I'm expecting to. That allows me to hit it closer to the target than a guy or a girl who's shooting in the 80s or the 90s. You need to practice predictable contact. That's exercises where you feel like you keep your arms straight when you hit the ball and you reduce the length of your follow through. In return, you get more structure to your arms a more consistent low point of your swing, better club face control, and more accurate distance. Another thing that clearly separates golfers shooting in the 80s and 90s from those shooting in the 70s is the number of penalty shots that they incur during a round of golf. You need to minimize and almost eliminate the number of times you're going to lose a golf ball, hit it out of bounds, or put it in a hazard. That typically is a problem from the tee. Most golfers can't control their ball. They're slicing and hooking the ball offline. So learning to control your club face and hitting the ball straighter with your driver is a tremendous way to learn to break 80. Those of you struggling to control the club face, I'm going to take the Hack Motion wrist sensor and just help you to identify where some of these problems will come from. For most of you, the higher your handicap, the more likely you are to slice the ball. Slicing the ball would be the ball that curves off to the right for the right-handed golfer. And that would typically stem from moving the club in a way that has the club face opening throughout the swing. What does that mean? Well, in terms of wrist movement, it means that as you swing this club back, you're actually twisting, inadvertently twisting, the wrist into a position where the club face is now spinning open. It's pointing up to the sky. The wrist movement responsible for that is called extension. This lead wrist is twisting in a way that's extending the wrist, moving it into this cupped condition. You'll see that on the screen. And that's pointing the club face up to the sky. If I was to return back to the ball with a similar amount of extension, the direction that that club face is pointing is clearly completely non-functional. That ball would go so far to the right, there's no way I would ever find it. So poor club face control during my swing is going to force me to make compensations to my swing path. I'll start swiping across the ball, swinging out to in, and trying to mitigate the open face. But even if I manage to do that, it's not consistent, and I'll be losing lots of distance. So instead of twisting the club in the backswing into an extended or open condition, which is what I'm demonstrating here, this lead wrist needs to be as flat as possible when we get to the top. And as we swing down, we're trying to manage and maintain this flat lead wrist all the way back down to the ball. So what starts out in a very small amount of extension, because of the way I have my lead hand on the club, I've got a little tiny bit of extension there, like 20 degrees. As I swing back to the top and get to the top of the swing, that number is reduced basically down to 0. Okay, plus 1 degrees of extension. It means I've flattened this wrist as I've swung back. And in order to do that, you may need to feel like you're twisting the club face in the opposite direction, twisting the wrist in the opposite direction, almost like you've got your hand on a motorcycle throttle and you're twisting it. That twisting happens in every golf swing. In many of your golf swings, it's happening incorrectly without you even realizing it. Hack Motion can help me to measure this, just like I talked about earlier. Measuring the different areas of your game to identify your strengths and weaknesses is vital if you really want to start to make these marginal gains that are going to get you from shooting in the 80s to shooting consistently in the 70s. Hack Motion allows you to measure what's happening down at the wrist level. And there's really nothing else out there that can help you to really understand what these hands and wrists are doing. So top of the swing, get rid of that extension. I've got almost a 0 number there. That means my wrist is practically flat. And then as I come down, I'm going to practice moving that club down and trying to maintain that very similar flat wrist. I've got 7 degrees of extension. I've got 5 degrees, 3 degrees. That movement down here in transition is where so many of you start to get it wrong when it comes to managing your club face. As you pull on the club, you twist the face inadvertently, and it causes you lots of issues with your driver. So practicing moving the wrist into this flat condition at the top, keeping it flat on the way down as best you can, and feeling like you keep that same relationship throughout impact will help you hit your driver much straighter. That was a nice straight drive down the fairway, and you look at the hack motion data, you'll see how I went from 25 degrees of extension at setup, and by the time I got to the top, I had reduced that slightly. Maybe not quite as much as I was feeling like I wanted to, but still very much within the ideal range. I'd reduced the extension as I moved to the top. And then as I swung down, I continued to reduce that extension all the way to the point where when I hit the ball, my wrist was in 2 degrees of flexion, or flat, basically. So it had gone from this extended condition to this flat condition. That's what you'll see in the best ball strikers, without doubt. Regardless of how they grip the club, regardless of their overall pattern, this wrist pattern, this wrist movement is conducive with the best players, okay? It's the way that the expert players move their wrist. If you can't do this, you're going to find it very difficult to control the club face, and ultimately very difficult to control your golf ball. So work on getting the correct wrist angles for the driver, hit more fairways, reduce the number of penalty shots you have to almost zero, and that'll be a big jump and a big leap towards shooting under 80. As I've already mentioned, what you specifically need in terms of breaking 80 consistently could be different to the couple of things I've mentioned in this video. But for me, those skills of controlling contact and hitting the driver straighter, reducing the number of penalty shots, are a big way to get closer to that goal. Other things that you can be doing in terms of making sure you're doing everything in your power to be the best golfer you can be. Make sure you have your clubs fitted for your swing. Something that, again, a small number of you have done, and yet overlooking that could be costing you 5 shots around. That includes getting fitted for all the clubs in your bag, from driver right the way through to putter. And one of the things I just talked about in terms of driver accuracy and consistency can be increased very quickly by having the right driver in your bag, the correct length of club, the correct shaft flex, and the correct head design. Those things could be the difference between shooting in the 80s versus shooting in the 70s. Even when it comes to using the same golf ball, having the same golf ball in your bag and using the same ball every time you play will start to build an expectation from you in terms of how that ball flies, the consistency of those distances that we talked about earlier. You could have a very sound technique, but if you're changing ball regularly or not using a consistent ball, you could make the same swing with your 7-iron and see more than 10 yards difference in how far that ball flies. That's no good if you're trying to break 80. So get your clubs fitted, make sure you see a professional for that, and begin to use the ball that you like and that you can be consistent with. The feel of that ball off of your wedges and off of your putter will also lead to a more consistent short game. All of these are small things that you can be doing to try and get those marginal gains to take you from shooting in the 80s to shooting in the 70s. I hope you found some of the tips in this video useful. If you did, please let me know, and do make sure you get down into the description, click on the link that will take you to more drills to help you work on your wrist mechanics.